Welcome to the first video in our series introducing the basic principles of the theory of evolution. In this introductory video, we're going to introduce the core principles of what the theory of evolution does show, as well as clarify some misunderstandings about what the theory of evolution is not meant to explain. Simply put, the theory of evolution is the best understanding that we have to explain where the biodiversity of all organisms on Earth comes from. Simply put, if we consider every single species of organism that exists on Earth in modern times, the theory of evolution fundamentally explains where all of these species originated from. Now, in order to understand how evolution does this, we need to look at what we call the evolutionary history, which is a word that we call phylogeny of modern species, and what better organism to use as an example than the common household domestic dog. Now, if we go back in time, eventually what we're going to find is what we call a common ancestor organism, which is always an organism that is now extinct, meaning that this organism no longer exists on modern Earth, but instead we would know this through the fossil record because we have evidence that this organism existed. And we call it a common ancestor because this organism here is an organism which modern organisms can trace their ancestry from, meaning that it isn't just the domestic dog that is related to this common ancestor, it's also wolves and other dog-like species that can all trace their descent or all say that they are descended from this common ancestor here. Now, the first misunderstanding that we have to clarify is how evolution occurs. Talking about evolution in terms of individual organisms is a little bit of a misunderstanding because evolution always occurs within populations, meaning that each organism that is descended from the common ancestor occurred because when a population of the common ancestor reproduced, their offspring were all going to have different characteristics, and depending on what those characteristics were, those characteristics either increased or decreased the likelihood that those offspring would survive into the next generation. So simply put, the theory of evolution is meant to show how populations of organisms that are now extinct, what we call primitive organisms. So the primitive organisms in this evolutionary history here would be the organisms that existed farther back in time, undergo change gradually over multiple generations, of course. Remember that this change occurs between generations and not with individual organisms of the population, and how over a long time scale we see the modern species, what we call derived species, existing with the characteristics that make them each distinct but easily allow us to trace their ancestry back to the extinct common ancestor here. So simply put, the other clarification to make about the theory of evolution is that this does not occur within the lifespan of a single organism, but instead takes place over multiple generations. And in the case of looking at large complex mammals such as dogs or even humans, for example, this process often ends up taking on the order of millions of years. However, in smaller, simpler organisms like bacteria, this is actually possible to observe within our lifetime. Now, what evolution is not meant to describe are changes that occur within an organism over its lifetime. So, for example, the process of a butterfly caterpillar undergoing a process that we call metamorphosis, meaning that it actually undergoes changes within its lifetime, becoming a chrysalis that we see here, and eventually changing to become a butterfly. Metamorphosis is fundamentally different than the process of evolution because this process occurs within the lifetime of a single organism as opposed to within an organism's population over a multiple generation time scale like this. And for me personally, I blame the presence of Pokemon as as being the single greatest contributor to this misunderstanding of evolution. So in short, before we conclude this video, evolution occurs across multiple generations over a much, much larger time scale and always occurs within populations of an organism, because whenever the population of a common ancestor population reproduces, all of their offspring are going to be born with characteristics that either give them advantages or disadvantages for the environment in which they live. And the offspring that survive determine what characteristics are going to be passed on and will exist in modern species that exist to this day. This concludes our introduction to what the theory of evolution is and what the theory of evolution is not. Join us in the next video where we take a look not at Charles Darwin's theory, but at a competing theory that, even though was proven incorrect by the analysis throughout history, acted as an important stepping stone towards our understanding of the modern model of how evolution works.